When all else fails, double down on your losing policies. The EU and the UK have recently adopted new 18th sanctions packages targeting Russia, with a focus on further restricting Russia's access to battlefield technologies, cutting revenue from energy exports, and sanctioning entities and individuals. The EU also lowered the oil price cap and expanded sanctions against the shadow fleet. Even though Russia is now the most sanctioned country by the United States and its allies, its economy has proven to be very resilient, while Western sanctions clearly backfired. In 2022, the United States used a weapon that it had used many times before and quite successfully: sanctions. But unlike previous cases, this time the United States and its allies promised an unprecedented economic assault, one that would cripple Russia's economy, isolate its elite, and destabilize the country from within. That was the plan. Nearly 3 years later, those predictions have proven to be widely naive and short-sighted. In fact, Russia's economy is doing far better than anticipated, and Russia is advancing on all fronts.
The harsher the sanctions, the worse it is for the ones who are introducing those sanctions. It's true for Germany, for France, etc. If you look at their economy, the amount of gas that they're buying is now larger because they are buying more liquefied natural gas, LNG. What if something happens in the Middle East? What's going to happen? Are they going to block Russian oil in some way? Well, they won't be successful at that. It's basically impossible right now. And the volumes of oil and oil products that are being consumed across the world is growing. They're growing because economies are growing, and you cannot escape that. There's nothing that's in these sanctions that could help the European economy.
Since the end of the Cold War, the United States has increasingly turned to sanctions as both a coercive tool and a form of moral warfare. Whether targeting Iran's peaceful nuclear program while at the same time enabling Israel to circumvent the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or targeting North Korea's missile tests or Venezuela's political elite, the aim has always been the same: inflict economic pain on the elite as well as on the civilians until the target complies. Eventually they will. But the largest and the most ambitious sanctions campaign to date, the one against Russia, has clearly become an example of Washington's failure. Despite thousands of targeted sanctions against Russian banks, industries, and individuals, Russia has increased its defense spending to an estimated 6% of its GDP, which is the highest point in decades. The United States' economic coercion revolved around isolating Russia from the global financial system. The ruble was supposed to plummet, inflation would skyrocket, and the Russian people would rise up against their leadership. And for a moment, it looked like that might happen, but Russia adapted, and it did so very, very quickly. By implementing capital controls, raising interest rates, and freezing outbound currency flow, Russia stabilized the ruble. And then within 2 months, 90% of withdrawn bank deposits had returned. Meanwhile, alternative trade routes were forged, particularly with nations that refused to support the sanctions regime, countries like China, India, and Turkey. In fact, trade with China alone has more than doubled since 2021. Exports to India are up tenfold. While Western policymakers hoped for economic suffocation, Moscow successfully pivoted. Russia's economy has shifted into a wartime footing, and although the long-term outlook shows a slowdown similar to the outlook for the global economy as a whole, its short-term performance is surprisingly resilient. Rather than isolate Russia, the sanctions have pushed it closer to China, closer to Iran, and other American rivals. Together, they're pursuing anti-dollar strategies, currency swaps, and new trade agreements to escape U.S. financial hegemony. In fact, the same sanctions that were designed to assert the U.S. dominance have propelled a new, more economically independent bloc, one that is a lot less vulnerable to future Western pressure. What's important is that the Russian public has not turned on Putin. Instead, they've rallied behind him. This is where the Western strategy fundamentally misunderstands Russia. There, sanctions have actually been perceived as proof of Western hostility, which it is. Economic coercion is aggression. Western leaders might argue that sanctions are better than doing nothing, that they chip away at Russia's technological edge, and that it sends a moral message. Although, arguably, due to its support of Israel's war in Gaza and the starvation of the Palestinians, the United States or Europe don't really have a foot to stand on when it comes to sending moral messages. Sanctions have inadvertently made Russia more defined, more self-sufficient, and a lot more aligned with China, a U.S. peer competitor. This is not a new story, of course. The United States has been sanctioning Cuba, for example, for over 60 years with little effect. Iran, Iraq, North Korea, none were brought to heel by economic pressure alone. And in many cases, sanctions actually harden leadership and punish civilians at the same time. Also, sanctions provide leaders with a scapegoat for domestic problems. So why persist with a strategy that rarely works? Why is there yet another round of sanctions imposed by the EU? Well, partly because it is politically convenient. Sanctions allow policymakers to look tough. They create the illusion of control until that control vanishes. As the Global South is working on alternative financial settlement platforms to decrease their dependence on the US-led institutions, that control keeps evaporating, quite literally, until it is fully gone. In the Western playbook, sanctions have already become permanent fixtures, symbolic punishments, if you will, rather than meaningful levers of diplomacy. And perhaps that's the biggest failure of all. Washington has single-handedly been destroying the very privilege that it should appreciate, the status of the US dollar. Instead of weakening Russia, sanctions have prolonged the conflict, strained alliances, and pushed the world closer to a multipolar economic order that's increasingly resistant to Western influence. The world is watching, it is learning, and it is responding. And the lesson that they're taking is that the era of US financial dominance can be circumvented, that it will be circumvented. And if you prepare well enough, it actually should be circumvented, because that is the way to protect your economic sovereignty and, quite arguably, your national security. To sum it up, the West is now left confronting the limits of economic coercion in a world that's no longer as unipolar as it once seemed. Thank you very much for watching. Thanks for joining me. If you found this breakdown helpful, hit like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments below, what is your take on economic sanctions? I would love to hear from you. See you in my next one. Take care.